Amen.
Well, welcome everybody. Glad that you're all a part of our service tonight, our class tonight. It's good to be together. I don't have everybody on the same screen on my device, so if you want to make a comment, you might have to actually speak out, so I'll know your work, and Josh can probably see more of me too. So we've been talking about this sort of this struggle, this problem in the church, not just in our church, not just in Church of Christ and our fellowship, but in most groups to some degree or the other. This problem of young adults walking away from church. I think by now we have kind of a look at some of the reasons that are given. We've talked in detail about some of those. And I want to sort of turn tonight toward some thoughts on solutions. And this is not something that I think, it's not going to be a one-size-fits-all kind of solution, because it's not a one-size-fits-all kind of problem. And it's probably going to require some adjustments that can be uncomfortable, that can be difficult. And that's because I think what a lot of this has exposed is that we live in a very different world than, say, 20 years ago, 30 years ago. There's a lot of ways in which the world we live in now is quite different. And that extends, it goes beyond just the church. Some of the problems that we've been talking about, most organizations or many organizations could look at them and see some version of the same problems. We started off by talking about the old Oldsmobile commercial, not your father's Oldsmobile. They were dealing with this same issue, this sort of abandonment of a generation for their product. And ways that they were trying to sort of deal with that. Now, it wasn't very successful. Oldsmobile it no longer exists as its own mark, I think. But they were facing the same issue. And I think a lot of organizations, a lot of whether they be volunteer organizations, voluntary membership sort of organizations, a lot of them are facing the same sorts of issues. And it's related to the ways in which our society is sort of turning away from brand loyalties and commitments to organizations in favor of some other things. We see it in stores that have had for generations this stable base of shoppers now sort of fighting to figure out how do we survive. We got less than a mile from us a giant Sears that's being torn down, right? It used to be Sears, and it's being torn down now because Sears is going through the same sort of thing. This isn't a one size kind of solution, and the solution won't be. But we can't just change our throw a different slogan up or throw a different brand up. We have in the church, we have some realities of our own that we proclaim the gospel of Christ. And so we've got to be loyal to that while we figure out how to engage with a generation that seems to be pulling away and turning away and not wanting to engage. So let's start with this. Somebody brought this up, and I really think it was an interesting. Might have been Steve. It was one of our first classes. Somebody brought up, maybe it was you, Nicole. Somebody brought up the problem of anxiety among teens and young adults. Colette can probably speak to this as well, but the sort of what's been called an epidemic of anxiety among teens and young adults. a couple of years ago, back right before COVID started, I actually went to a workshop at Lipscomb on just that, on dealing with some of the anxiety that teens particularly in this case, but teens, college age students were dealing with. And the workshop was done by Danny Woods, who's the Dean of Student Wellness at Lipscomb, and also by Shanna Ray, Dr. Shanna Ray, who's the chair of the psychology department. And they were addressing this issue. To start with, what do you guys think about that? Have you guys had that experience that that you see an increased amount of anxiety in teens and young adults in our world? Is that something that you've had experience with?
Yes. Yes.
Anybody want to share some examples or some things that you relate to?
You mean what I experienced going through that?
Sure. I'm particularly talking about experience dealing with or recognizing, seeing teens and young adults dealing with the issue of anxiety. But certainly, if somebody wants to talk about their own experiences with it, that's fine too.
I mean, I hate to talk about my girls. I don't think they would mind me sharing this, but they've both been dealing with anxiety, and it hasn't just been COVID. I mean, the last 2 years has been worse, but in high school, I mean, prior to all of this, I just felt like it's almost like social media and being detached from personal interactions with people makes them more nervous to interact with people. Like they would rather just sit behind a screen or with their phone to communicate. And so they're afraid to make a phone call or to go into a public social situation. It seems worse than ever. And it's not just them, it's their friends. That's what it seems like.
I met with a teen today, one of my clients, and she was talking about testing and the PSAT, et cetera, because in the spring, that's where they're going in to be placed in high school. And it was telehealth, and I looked at her and said, "Are you crying?" And she said, "Yes." And I go, "Why are you crying?" "I'm stupid. This girl has all A's and a B. And she says, "I'm stupid because I didn't get the grade I wanted." So we spent the rest of the time talking about changing her mindset, what standardized tests mean, what her GPA, working hard in school, means. Just amazing. And I think we have put a lot, and I'm talking about adults, and I'm talking about education too, but we have put a lot on the shoulders of our kids. All this testing and the expectations of where they should be. She says, "I'm going to be in the dumb group." And I go, well, let's not use words like that. Let's not say there's a dumb group. And, but it's the pressure that she just wept. And then I gave her some things that she could say to her mom, because her mom's just going to say, "Well, you just read more and put down the phone." So I go, okay, that's probably true, but let's talk to your mom and say you need help. And I'm here to advocate for you. Your parents are there to advocate for you. But just that work, here's the smart kid and very, she's artistic, she's a runner, just a lot going for her, but just the pressures of academics. And it's not the daily academics, it's the testing, the standardized testing and what that means and where that will place you. And then of course, Nicole, you're talking about your daughters, I would imagine the same kind of things in college, right? That the pressure to get it right, that there's no room for error. And I don't know what we've done to make our younger people feel that way, but it's like there's no room for error. And I told her about when I was getting my PhD, I would sit at the dining room table crying because I couldn't do stats. And I saw her kind of look, I go, yeah, and I was an adult. And I would cry and I had to call and get help. But it's like, there's no room for error.
Don't you think it's because that social media puts like this, I don't know, like you can't even reach the goal, whatever it looks like everybody's doing, everybody's accomplishing, everything looks perfect. I think that puts a lot of pressure on them too.
Absolutely. I wrote that down when you were saying it. I can't think of the couple. Remember the young lady died and they were on a trip with, this was in the news, and the boyfriend, they just figured he shot himself. Mm-hmm. But all their pictures on social media was that there were this loving couple, that there was nothing going wrong. And so that speaks to what you're saying, Nicole. It's just this image that they have to live up to. And there's just no or error.
Nobody posts themselves sitting at the dining room table crying because they can't do statistics, right?
Oh, the stats. Maybe I should do that.
Right. Nobody posts that kind of stuff, right? Everybody's posting the perfect plasticky, look, the kids are all dressed and I'm all dressed and everything looks great, and nobody puts anything else up. And so, yeah, you start seeing enough of that. And I don't mean to demonize social media, because part of the problem, I think, also has to do with, and this is what one of the things Dr. Ray suggested, that part of the problem has to do with the fact that we have no community. We have a breakdown of community in which to share some of these things. It probably made quite a difference to that young woman who shared that about yourself, because she's probably not hearing that. She's probably not in a lot of relationships where she can hear that sort of thing. She can hear that other people struggle too, that other people are dealing with the same sorts of things. I think that's one of the ways I tend to dismiss it. Well, everybody struggles. Everybody's anxious sometimes. Well, yes. And I know that because I have community and I have relationships with people who have told me, who share those struggles, but not everybody has that. And some of the usual places where that kind of community happens either don't exist or perhaps are a source of some of the stress. And so we struggle. Go ahead. I'm sorry.
It's Christy.
Yeah, hey, Christy.
Hey, but I mean, I think I think the images are very important, and so much of that is that's kind of what you're talking about. But reality is stressful right now. Yes. COVID or no COVID, you can do everything right. You can study. You can be a solid student, and you cannot get into your colleges, or you can not find a job. Or it's very hard to be average. You can be a good basketball player and never make the team. I mean, we are so driven by everything has to be good, better, best. And I actually think we really need to make room for the average and the strugglers in a way that we just, I so often hear, this isn't like, how often when you hear about a tragedy, do they tell you, this was a star football player who died. This was a straight A student who died. That doesn't matter. It was a teenager who died, or a young adult, it was I don't know how we don't transmit that you're okay the way you are. You really are okay and the way you are. And I think it trickles down into other things we do as well. And then they look at the world and they say, I'm going to be gone. But when, climate change and all that stuff, does anybody care about the world when I'm 50, or 40, whatever. So I'm not saying there's an easy answer, but it's not just the image, it's the reality too of what they're dealing with. And I really think this, you're okay the way you are stuff is not just, I've just read a book about Mr. Rogers, so it's on my mind, but it's not just that, right? It's if we matter to God the way we are, then, it should be okay to be average or whatever.
And Christy, you're saying something really powerful, because as I work with single adult people and teens, this is one of the mantras I teach or have them saying, I am good enough. I value myself because so much of that is missing. And we have to make room for the average. You're absolutely right. I'm working with a doctor out in Phoenix somewhere, Arizona. And the goal is to pump up the average kids, to help them know if we're going to give a scholarship, we want to give it to the average. And someone questioned me because if you know anything about scholarships, it all goes to the A-type person and a personality. And we're trying to shift it and say, no, we need to see the average kids. We need to let them know that they matter. But it's so much of that, and teach them resilience. I have clients come in and say, they're trying to get that job you're talking about. And this is mind-blowing. And they are convinced they're going to get this job. And so I throw a monkey wrench in the mix, and I say, but what if you don't get it? They're like, I can't believe you're saying, what if I don't get it? And what will happen? I go, well, I think it's important if we're going to be resilient and understand that you may not get it. So we need to come up with coping skills and understanding. And so much of that is not the case. Everybody's a winner. And that can't be either. So I think it's a lot of truth telling and being the person that, as you speak with young adults, the truth tellers. And I think that's what we talked about early on, is that we make mistakes in the church too. We're not perfect either, but truth tellers, because everything else is presenting like everything's perfect.
Is it worse than it ever was? I mean, I remember putting pressure on myself to be in the top 10% of my high school class. And, this is something I really wanted. And, I remember I was certainly not among the more popular group. And, you have the cheerleaders and there were images of kids who seemed to have everything. And then, then there were the ones like how I felt like me, who we were just kind of going along. But I did try to achieve more, but I felt like that was pressure I put on myself rather than coming from other. But is it really that much work now? No, I don't think so.
Well, yes, it is. It is definitely more.
Aspects of this whole conversation, the things that somehow worse now. I think every generation has a tendency to have tunnel vision about itself and say the same thing. That's the age when you start making decisions for yourself. You have what's guidance from your parents, and it's scary for everybody.
So let me just talk about myself a little bit. Yes, there was like when I was in school, there was pressure to have good grades. There was pressure to, I was a kid in the 80s, a teenage boy in the 80s in Tennessee. There was a pressure to play football. There was a pressure to excel in sports. There was a pressure to, all those pressures were there. Now, I don't think, for instance, I'm not sure the competition for college was as extreme and as at least I didn't feel that. But here's what helped me deal with some of that anxiety. I had parents who let me know that I was loved and accepted and valued, even if I didn't accept. And I often did not accept. I think that I had a group of friends at church, particularly, with which I felt very much like I belonged. The ways I went to school with some of them I didn't go to school with. I had those relationships there in which I felt I belonged, and it didn't matter. And if I blew it, they loved me too, and they might give me a hard time and make fun of me a little bit, but it was going to be in good fun, and I knew I felt I belonged. I think those were two things that really made a difference. And some of what Dr. Ray suggests really resonated with me, that a lot of our young adults don't have some of those relationships and some of that community to help them deal with the ways in which they don't meet up to the standards. And who can say, you know what, I blew that too. You know what, I messed up there too. And I survived. You know, I got through it, and here's what I did, and here's the way I rebooted. You know. Go ahead,
Patrick. It's Ron. Let me just toss in an idea that it doesn't matter whether it's worse today than it was in the past, because whether or not it is or isn't, I mean, I have an opinion on that myself, but whether or not it isn't, that's their story. That's their perception right now, that they are feeling these pressures and the like. And, you know, in law firms, one of the things I oftentimes saw was puzzled by was, and this may just be anecdotal or in the firms I was with, but women partners in law firms were often hardest on women associates in law firms. And there seemed to be this idea of, well, I went through it and I got through it. So, you know, you should be able to as well. Whether or not what our generation or other generation, whether or not the pressure was higher or lower, the key is not to let that pressure, your prior experience, basically turn you sort of cold to the problems of today's youth. Whether it was intenser or less intense, you draw on that experience to sympathize and validate the feelings that these our current teens are having. Not to say, well, I got through it, so you should be able to as well, and then just sort of turn away. And I think actually getting to the church's role, you already sort of mentioned it, but you know, the church's role, and I'm looping back a little bit into the average thing, the church's role really has to be to provide that environment where we really do value these people. And I was reminded, of course, because I listen to public radio a lot, but you know, Garrison Keillor oftentimes always introduced his monologue, right, of Lake Wobegon, where all the women are strong and all the men are good looking and all the children are above average. Because even though we've been talking about average kids, the point is every kid, every person is above average in some way. So we need to point they need to change their perspective of judging themselves in that sort of holistic way and downgrading themselves, and to value the strong. I'm sure that's what Colette helps her patients and do in that respect, and get away, because you know, however average you are or however even below average you are, God loved you. Right? God loves you, and that makes you special. And I think that's the message, that's the support we need to have. By the way, one of the things we need to also do is make sure that church is not increasing the pressure on these kids as well, because I feel like I'm failing here also, right, in this environment. But I'll step back now.
I agree.
This group of kids, they're not judgmental, and they don't like judgmental people, and that's the first thing that puts them straight out the door is, you know, if they
You faded out there. You faded out there, Nicole.
I said these kids don't like judgmental people. They're gonna walk out the door if they think you're judging them or others. You know, at least that's what I see.
I think you're right. I want to look at a text from the Bible, Matthew 18. Turn to Matthew 18. Grab a Bible, grab something. Turn to Matthew 18, and I want to look at this text. Now, where we usually pay attention to this text is in verse 19 or 20, 19 and 20, especially verse 20, where 2 or 3 gather in my name, there I am with them. which is a neat little verse that just reminds us that, that Jesus is with us when we're together in his name. And that's really cool and everything. The rest of Matthew 18 is about dealing with that reality and acting as though that's true. And so it begins in verse 3, verse 2, Jesus, verse 1, the disciples, who's the greatest in the kingdom? So already we're who's above average, right? Where's the line and who's above it? Who are the folks who excel in the kingdom? And in answer, what does Jesus do? Somebody read verse 2 and 3.
He called a little child and had him stand among them. And he said, I tell you the truth, unless you change and become like little children, you will never enter the kingdom of heaven. And then read verse 4 too. Therefore, whoever humbles himself like this child is the greatest in the kingdom of heaven. So that sort of at the beginning, we're dealing with, all right, who's the greatest? Who's above the average line? And Jesus says, you know what? If you're worried about that, you're worried about the wrong things. Here's a child. Look at this child. This is your model for greatness in the kingdom. This is what you are to become, to be great in the kingdom. And to humble yourself, to take this lowly position. And then verse 5, whoever welcomes one such child in my name welcomes me. Now in this chapter, we're not just talking about kids when we mention kids. Jesus has already said, you take the lowly position of a child, and whoever welcomes somebody like that in my name welcomes me. I mean, think about the ways Jesus said, if I was poor and you took care of me, I was hungry and you fed me, I was naked and you clothed me. Oh, when did we do that? Whenever you did that for one of the least of these, you did it for me. So this is this idea we're talking about, I think. Making room, I love that line, I wrote it down when Christy said it, making room for the average and the strugglers. That's what Jesus is talking about here. He's talking about the folks who aren't excelling, they're barely getting by, and Jesus says, when you welcome them in my name, you welcome me. And then he goes on. Somebody read verse 6.
If anyone causes one of these little ones, those who believe in me, to stumble, it would be better for them to have a large millstone hung around their neck and to be drowned in the depths of the sea.
I mean, that's pretty serious, right? Yeah. So these people I'm talking about, these average and these strugglers, if you contribute to that in some way or the other, if you contribute to the weight they're carrying, if you contribute to their struggles, woe unto you. Now, I don't think Jesus is really advocating we drown people, but I think he's saying this is a bad thing you're doing. This is a terrible thing that you're doing. If you contribute in any way to the burden these strugglers are carrying, these little ones. By the way, we're all little ones sometimes. We're all vulnerable sometimes. We're all hurting and we're all struggling and we're all dealing with the fact that we didn't measure up and we didn't do it right and we feel terrible about it. We all struggle with that sometimes. We ought to know what that feels like. And sometimes we forget, I think. So again, making room for these these strugglers. Let's skip down a little bit. Verse 10, see that you do not despise one of these little ones. For I tell you that there are angels in heaven that always see the face of my Father in heaven. I don't know exactly what that means, but I really love it. I think that's really great, especially if I'm one of those little ones at the moment. That's a neat thing. That in some way or the other, God is taking special notice of these folks. That's God always, right? He's always taking notice of the strugglers, of the folks who are weighed down. Jesus said My yoke is easy. My burden is light. If you're weighed down, come to me and I'll give you rest. So then verse 12. Somebody read verses 12 through 14. I think this is really relevant for what we've been talking about throughout these last few weeks, months.
What do you think? If a man owns 100 sheep and one of them wanders away, will he not leave the 99 on the hills and go to look for one that wandered off? And if he finds it, truly I tell you, he is happier about that one sheep than about the 99 that did not wander off. In the same way, your Father in heaven is not willing that any of these little ones should perish.
So, how many times do church people tend to say or think, I've thought it. I don't know if I've said it. I hope I've never said it. I've thought it. Well, if they want to walk away, let them go. Well, Jesus says they matter. And in the metaphor, who are the 99 sheep in the metaphor? What does that represent?
That's us.
What's that?
That's us.
I mean, that's the folks who are okay right now, right? They're the folks who are, they're where they ought to be. They're getting the nourishment they need. Jesus says the shepherd, the good shepherd, is going to leave them because they're fine and go search for this little lost. But that's not saying the 99 don't matter. It's saying how much that one is valuable, how much that one who's wandering away matters.
And the language is interesting there because, you know, as Christians and as devout Christians, we say that we want to do God's will. Well, this passage says God is not willing that any of these be lost. Well, that's a pretty strong statement. And if we're carrying out God's will, or we purport to be, we need to take that very seriously, I think.
That's right. That's right. Again, this is about this community that we're talking about, where when we're together, Jesus is present among us. This is the hard work of that community. We don't create the community, but we can certainly either encourage it or disrupt it. And this is about encouraging. This is about one of the things we do to really help to make sure this community exists and can thrive. Verse 15, if your brother or sister sins, go and point out their fault, just between the two of them. If they listen to you, you've won them over. If they won't listen, take one or two others along so that every matter may be established by the testimony of 2 or 3 witnesses. If they still refuse to listen, tell it to the church. And if they refuse to listen even to the church, treat them as you would a pagan or a tax collector. Now, this isn't the little one that's struggling, right? This isn't the one who's wandered away and gotten lost. Because we know what we're supposed to do in those cases. This is the one who is already turning away from the community, already trying to assert his own will over the will of God in this community that we're talking about. This is the person who is already disrupting that community.
Patrick?
Yes.
I think it's an interesting thing. I don't know in the original language, but the verse 15 says, if another member of the church sins against you, it doesn't say, does something you think is wrong. I think there might be a distinction there.
There is a textual variant there.
That's what I was wondering about the original.
You very well may not be original here. Your point is well taken, though. I don't think this means, every time somebody goofs up, we got to go have a meeting to go set them straight. Most of the time in the church, most of the time in the people of God, when somebody goofs up, they know it, and they're repentant immediately, and they're not going to need this.
Nicole said earlier that they don't like
Right.
People who are judgmental. Well, isn't that what this is right here? You're judging someone in a fault.
I mean, there are times when.
I mean, I know that I think that's, you know, something that has to happen sometimes because people do things that they shouldn't be doing.
It has to happen sometimes. You know, a classic one that comes to mind. You have a case in a church of an adult abusing a child. All right, we got to do something about that. We got to address that situation. That's something that's got to be dealt with, and it's got to be dealt with in a very specific kind of way.
That's actually a criminal offense.
Exactly, that's a criminal offense, and so some other things have to be done as well in that situation. Somebody is leaving their spouse for somebody else. Just walking away from their marriage, their family for somebody else. Somebody is teaching destructive things to the body of Christ. And this requires some wisdom, it requires some understanding, but there are certainly times where we have to say, no, we're drawing a line.
Yeah, but Patrick, I think we always want to test the boundaries and define the boundaries when the boundaries are way off most of the time, and in the far distance. And actually, I think this passage is there to show how difficult it is to actually get somebody out of the community. It's complicated. It requires various things. But most of the time, if we just focus on day-to-day life, we don't have to define these boundaries. That's, you know, Pharisees were always trying to define boundaries and stuff. And I think we lose the point here, which is not being judgmental is probably more the norm in relating to people, because after all, we also know that before we talk to somebody else, we have to take the beam out of our own eye, right? And who is going to throw the first stone? Our teachings out there as well. And that seems to be more of a norm for daily living, at least the way I see it. But
well, I think this is something that is going to happen rarely in a church's life, hopefully. It's something that's not going to come up very often, hopefully. If this is something that keeps coming up, where we get to this point where, you know, we're talking about treating people, the possibility of treating people like a pagan or a tax collector, withdrawing from them, putting them out of the community, in effect, something's wrong if this comes up over and over again. This is something that is for those extreme offenses, where the community is threatened. It's not just, I don't like what you did. It's not even just, I think what you did was wrong. There's something more to it here. And so now on the judgment piece of it,
yeah.
Easiest thing in the world is to say, don't be judgmental. Yeah. Everybody at times looks at somebody's actions and says, that's wrong. That can't be abided. That can't be lived with. That can't be endured. We all at times make that judgment, right? Now that doesn't mean I hate the person that's done it. That doesn't mean it's certainly not an opportunity for me to take advantage of the situation. There are times when we all at some point or the other say, and again, this is not just one person, right? This is the church being involved. This is not just.
Oh, I was just going to say that's what I was specifically talking about when I said that about the judgmental. And where I was talking about that was with people in the church who just automatically maybe think the worst because they're a teenager, because they're a young person. Why are they not here? Why are they, and just jumping to some conclusion instead of coming in with, looking at them through love and thinking the best of them. That's what I was talking about, which they've had to deal with that a lot with people in the church.
And Nicole, when I think about judgment, I think here, I don't think sin and judgment are equal. I think the Bible gives us real clear definition of what sins are. Now, we don't need to get on a slippery slope and say this and that, but we know what sins are. Judgment is an attitude of our hearts. It's what you're saying. As soon as we see something, we assume something in a bad way. And so when I am dealing with my sin, when someone talks to me about a specific sin, I don't think they're judging me unless the attitudes of their heart show that. But to point out sin is what the scripture's talking about here. But to judge someone, again, it's an attitude or superiority, or thinking you know what's best. And there's no place for that. And it does turns me off, turns everybody off, teens and young adults.
What is at stake here in this passage is this community that we're talking about. Something is happening that is putting that community at risk. It's threatening that relationship. I think of Ananias and Sapphira, right? I always get that wrong. Ananias and Sapphira. I mean, man, such a. If you don't remember that, it's in Acts. It's where Ananias says, is that right? Is it Ananias and Sapphira?
They sell a piece of
Yes. Okay. I was second guessing myself because I always Priscilla and Aquila. I always get them and Priscilla and Aquila mixed up. Anyway, Ananias and Sapphira in Acts, and they're. Jan, it was Jan's favorite story. Ananias sells some land because everybody else is doing it, right? Not everybody, but other people are doing it. They're selling land and laying the money at the apostles' feet to be used for the poor, to be used for whatever. And Ananias does the same thing, except Ananias isn't ready to part with the whole purchase price. And so he keeps some of it, but sort of gives the impression that he's giving it all to the church. And he's struck dead for doing that. And Priscilla, who comes in later and doesn't know about all this, Sapphira, who comes in later, I told you I'd do it. Sapphira, who comes in later, and
lies too.
She lies too. She hasn't been told what's happened to Ananias. She lies too, and she's struck dead. And in fear-filled, nobody wanted to have much to do with these people because that was scary. That was a frightening thing. Well, I think the struggle, the reason for that punishment has to do with this community. You've undermined this community, and that in so doing, you're grieving the Holy Spirit, you're lying to the Lord, and you've broken the trust and the bond of this community it's formed. And that's what the problem seems to be. And that's why it's so serious.
Well,
go ahead, John.
And Ananias and Sapphira, they were clearly prominent members of the church.
Yeah.
And I feel like we wouldn't have any problem with this passage whatsoever if the own power structures that we build weren't embedded within the church. The example you gave about a member abusing a child or abusing anyone, it's a fortuitous you came up with that. You said that example because in so many churches, that's the kind of sin that doesn't get.
It gets swept under the rug.
Yeah, and if there was more equality the text doesn't say if a member of the church without a fancy title sins, an elder or minister should be able to point out their fault. It says if your brother or sister sins, it's a level playing field. There should be. So often what I see is there is a designated executor of the sentence and a designated sinner. And it's so often that what that boils down to is who's on the church payroll and who isn't. And I feel like, young adults should feel that they have as much right to go to an elder or a minister and talk about a sin and respectfully and lovingly address a sin in their life to the same extent that that elder or minister would feel comfortable talking to them. Any of what I said makes sense.
It does. It absolutely does, and you're absolutely right. And I think this is part of that level playing field, right? We're not talking about the folks who excel. We're not talking about the folks with the titles. We're not talking about the folks who have the upper echelon of whatever, and that doesn't matter. And so yeah, and so I mean, I think what Ron says is really true here. We're talking about, in this case, and Jesus says it, we're talking about an outlier kind of situation. But it does show how much this matters, how much this community matters, and how when something is threatening it, it has to be dealt with. But let's go right to the next. Let's go right to, so we got to our passage about 2 or 3 gather in my name. Look at verse 21. Somebody read verse 21 and 22.
Then Peter came to him and said, Lord, how many times could my brother sin against me, and I forgive him? As many as 7 times. I tell you, not as many as 7, Jesus said to him, but 70 times 7.
Not 7 times, 77 times.
77?
Yeah, so we're talking, right, we're talking about in one passage, in one section of this, we're talking about sometimes folks have to be removed from the community. But what's the norm? The norm is we forgive, and we forgive, and we forgive, and we keep forgiving. And that's the community. That's who we are. That's the relationship that we have with one another. We don't tolerate the stuff that's going to destroy the community. We can't. But up until that point, we forgive, and we forgive, and we forgive, and we forgive again. And of course, 77 isn't the magic number either, right? He's just saying, forgive as much as you need to. Forgive as often as you need to forgive. Because it matters that much. Yes,
never cut off grace.
Right, never cut off grace. Yeah, very good. Yeah.
Keep it going.
Right. Christy, go ahead.
Well, I find, practically speaking, the earlier part that you talked about with causing someone to stumble, we all know this very well, but I've been thinking a lot about what that really means in terms of examples, because I think we all would say, you know, offering alcohol to an alcoholic is causing a stumbling block, or inviting someone to, you know, I don't know, go do something that's tempting them into sin is a stumbling block. But I actually don't think it just includes that. And so I've been struggling with the idea of what it means to cause a stumbling block, especially in the context of what we're talking about in these classes. Because I think some of our insistence on instruction may, to some people, be creating a stumbling block. And I don't know how to resolve that issue. I don't mean loving teaching. I mean, some of the things we've referred to about, well, this is the clear answer. And I don't want to be, I'm really not sure about it, because I really think that some of what we're talking about may be that stumbling block, rightfully or wrongfully. Not saying anyone intends it to be that, and I don't know how to get around that, but it's how it seems.
I don't know exactly what you're referring to as far as some of the things we're talking about, or some of the instruction. I think we ought to go on a little excursus for next class, and let's talk about that, because I think that has a lot to do with. I think it's a good point, Christy, that it may have a lot to do with some of the things we're talking about. We're talking about folks who are struggling, who are stumbling, who are walking away, who are who are wandering, we're talking about some of these folks who have in some way or the other not found the kind of community in which when we're together, Jesus is there, and they've not found that. And so I think we ought to think about, what is it that Jesus is referring to here? What is he dealing with that can be a cause for stumbling? Go ahead, Christy, I'm sorry.
No, I referred back to things we've been talking about. I didn't mean today per se, but if something I tell a person, whether they're young or not, but says, well, in this church, we believe X, we need to be awfully careful about that really being an essential belief. Because if they walk away from maybe our church, but maybe Christianity, I suspect we might have caused that stumbling block unintentionally. So that's, I think, maybe a better articulation of what I mean. If we say, here you need to believe X. Now, I'm not saying anything goes. I really am not. But I'm just saying we need to be careful about which pieces are essential.
Yeah, James points out how don't all of you aspire to be teachers, because those who teach bear a responsibility. They bear a strong responsibility to the body, to the community, to these little ones. Well, and I think that's a real good way to articulate it.
And in that respect too, I think sometimes, maybe even out of quasi good intentions or good intentions, we sort of try to put our priorities as to what people need to deal with and how they should rank those in importance. We try to foist those on other people. And I think anyone with a degree of self-reflection will realize that all of us have lots of problems. And the order in which we try to take on and address those things is something oftentimes between us and God as he tries to shape us. And we can't do everything at once. I mean, in a way we can, but in a way we can't. And to basically insist that you have to resolve this now. There are lots of questions. There are lots of conduct issues that sometimes just need to percolate for a while until somebody can grapple with them or take them on. And it's not that they might not be willing, but to basically force them to do it, they may very well say, I can't take that, and I'm just going to leave, and the like. And I think that's an option for many teenagers. When you try to exert that pressure, they'll just reject it. And that's the absolute wrong thing, wrong result that we want.
So let's start next week's class by sort of chasing down that excursus a little bit. What are some of these things that may cause, and let's try to find some biblical examples, try to look at scripture and sort of see what you can come up with as examples of people who have had their faith disrupted by some of the things that Jesus is talking about. I got a couple of things sort of percolating in my head right now I want to chase down, and maybe you do too. And if you don't come up with anything, that's fine. Just come back next week. We'll talk about what we have, and then we will continue talking about, because what we're getting at is building community in which people can find a place where they belong and they fit, and they aren't feeling added performance anxiety. They're not feeling like they have to pretend to be something they're not. And again, I'm not saying that we're doing any of that. I want to talk about, from a positive standpoint, how do we start to construct or build or live in this community, live this community out in ways in which people can find a place and know they fit, know they belong, and know that whatever else is going on in their lives, the church is there for them and is there to help them walk through and navigate and deal with the things they have to deal with. So we'll pick up there next week. I appreciate all your comments, all your good thoughts.